This, along with the fact that it was Kvyat's home race and the President Putin was watching, made it very embarrassing for him and for Red Bull. He was given a 10-second stop-go penalty for the collision, and Red Bull were not happy. Not because of the 10-second stop, not because of the penalty. No, they didn't. Not because of the penalty. They probably didn't care about that. They were angry because as well as screwing up his own race, Kvyat also screwed up Daniel Ricciardo's race. They were angry because, as well as screwing up his own race, he also screwed up their number one driver, Daniel Ricciardo's race. And we know how much Red Bull love their number one drivers now, don't we? Reggie. Red Bull also had a dilemma. Red Bull also had a dilemma in that Max Verstappen was starting to. Red Bull also had a dilemma in that Max Verstappen was starting to produce some pretty sensational performances for Toro Rosso. And if they kept him there much longer, they were at risk of losing him to a bigger team. So I suspect as a result of all of those factors, Red Bull decided to drop. So after the Russian Grand Prix, as a result of. So after the Russian Grand Prix, I suspect as a result of all these factors, Red Bull decided to drop Danny Kvyat for the remainder of the season and replace him with Max Verstappen, with Kvyat. So after the Russian Grand Prix, I suspect as a result of all of these, Red Bull decided to drop Danny Kvyat to Toro Rosso, swapping him with Max Verstappen for the remainder of the season. For the remainder of the season. For the remainder of the season. Or even he's called a polo. It's called a polo. In his title, he's called more polo. It's called more polo. There wasn't all that much sympathy given to Kvyat. Most people thought he deserved. Most people thought he deserved to be dropped. Most of the F1 community thought he deserved to be dropped, seemingly forgetting his extremely successful 2015 campaign, if they even appreciated it in the first place. Or even that Kvyat had scored a podium in only the previous race. Or even the fact that Kvyat had scored a podium in the very. Or even the fact that Kvyat scored a podium in the race previous to this. Or even the fact that Kvyat scored a podium in only the previous race. Or even the fact that Kvyat had scored a podium in only, or even the fact that Kvyat scored a podium in only the previous race, and, or even the fact that Kvyat had scored a podium in only, or even the fact that Kvyat had scored a podium in only the previous race, and in his entire Red Bull career had more podiums than Daniel Ricciardo. And in his whole Red Bull career, he scored more podiums than Daniel Ricciardo did in the same period. Honestly, to be honest, I can. But that doesn't. To be honestly, I can understand why Red Bull made this decision, but regardless of that, dropping a driver for making one mistake is incredibly harsh. Season, 2 crashes in 1 year. Max Verstappen has double. Max Verstappen has more. Max Verstappen has more than that. Max Verstappen has more. And at this point, everyone will probably be letting me know in the comments, "Oh, it wasn't just one mistake, though, was it?" And you're right, it wasn't. In the 2015 season, Kvyat did have a couple of crashes, but that was it. It was only 2 crashes. But that was it, though. But that was it. It was only 2 crashes. In the 2015 season, Kvyat did have a couple of crashes at Suzuka and Kota, but that was it. But that's it. It was only 2 crashes. While that's 2 more than you want, it's not exactly. And while that's 2 more than you'd ideally want, it's hardly season-ending. Max Verstappen's had double that amount of crashes in just Monaco. Max Verstappen's had more crashes than that Max Verstappen's had more crashes than that just at Monaco. Max Verstappen's had more crashes than that at Monaco alone. And if you think Christian Horner was angry at Kvyat for crashing twice, how do you think Eric Boullier must have felt? How do you think Eric Boullier must have felt at having his cars driven by Pastor Maldonado and Romain Grosjean? How do you think Eric Boullier would have felt having his cars driven by Pastor Maldonado and Romain Grosjean? The answer is probably not great. But as shitty a situation as it was for Kvyat, he's still a good driver. Verstappen's still an 18-year-old. The Red Bull still wasn't that competitive, and the Toro Rosso actually kind of was. The Red Bull was still pretty competitive, and the Toro Rosso wasn't actually that much slower. The Red Bull was still unreliable, and the Toro Rosso was actually pretty competitive that year. And with Max Verstappen being thrown straight into a car that he'd never driven before, it surely wouldn't be that hard for Kvyat to... It surely wouldn't be that hard for Kvyat to keep up with, or even beat Max Verstappen in the Spanish. It surely wouldn't be hard for Kvyat to. It surely wouldn't be that hard for Kvyat to keep up, or even beat Max Verstappen at the next round in the Spanish Grand Prix, would it? But as you can see, when we got to Barcelona, that theory kind of fell apart. And from here, it really just went from bad to worse for Kvyat. As he was clearly struggling in confidence, he was never struggling in confidence, he was consistently slower than his teammate. He was reunited once again with his old friend Carlos Sainz, but clearly struggling with a lack of confidence. He was unable to match Sainz. But clearly struggling with a lack of confidence, he was unable to match Sainz consistently, regularly being much slower than him and very rarely matching him. But clearly struggling with a lack of confidence, he was very rarely able to match Carlos Sainz. But clearly struggling with a lack of confidence, the speed just wasn't there for Kvyat. He struggled to get on the pace with Sainz, He consistently struggled to get on the pace of Sainz and was usually a lot slower than him. He consistently struggled to get on the pace of Sainz and was usually a lot slower than the Spaniard. Clearly suffering from a lack of confidence, he consistently struggled to get on the pace of Sainz. Clearly struggling with a lack of confidence, he was clearly struggling with a lack of confidence. He was clearly struggling with a lack of Clearly with a lack of confidence, he was struggling to get on the pace of Carlos Sainz and was consistently slower throughout the rest of the year, seemingly struggling to adapt to the Toro Rosso, seemingly struggling to adapt to the slower Toro Rosso. Now, in fairness to Red Bull, they did have the decency to In fairness to Red Bull, they did have the decency to keep Kvyat for the following year in 2017, which given what he'd done before he was dropped, I think he did deserve. Even though, given what he'd done before he was dropped, I think he did deserve, even though Pierre Gasly had just won the GP2 championship. But with him and Brendan Hartley, but with him and the human attached to Brendan Hartley's hair, along with the human attached to Brendan Hartley's hair, putting pressure on. But with Gasly, along with the human attached to Brendan Hartley's hair in the. But with Gasly, along with the human attached to Brendan Hartley's hair on. But with Gasly, along with the human attached to Brendan Hartley's hair in the Red Bull Driver Academy, putting pressure on him, Toro Rosso would need to see an improvement from Kvyat. Toro Rosso would need to see an improvement from Kvyat in 2017. So was it an improvement? Well, kind of, yeah, when he was allowed to. So was it an improvement? Well, kind of, yeah, when he was allowed to. I say that because this season was littered with bad luck for Kvyat, having terrible reliability and having a lot of bad luck in key moments. I say that because this was a season which Kvyat had terrible reliability. and had a lot of bad luck in key moments. However, while it was an improvement, he was still off the. However, while it was an improvement from the last year, he was still off the pace of Carlos Sainz. And more worryingly, And more worryingly, the torpedo moments we'd saw from previous years had started to creep back into his driving, with incidents in Austria and with back-to-back incidents in Austria and Silverstone. The third incident came in Singapore, in a soaking wet race where both him and Sainz had made their way up to very good points. In a soaking wet race where both him and Sainz had made their way up to good point. In a soaking wet race where both him and Sainz had made their way up to solid points positions. But Kvyat then threw his points away by locking up and stuffing it in the wall. But unfortunately, Kvyat stuffed it in the wall again, throwing away his points that he'd worked so hard. But unfortunately, Kvyat stuffed it in the wall again, throwing away all the points that he'd worked so hard. But unfortunately, Kvyat stuffed it in the wall again, throwing away all the points that he'd worked so hard to initially. Throwing away all the points that he'd initially worked so hard for. This proved to be the final straw for Helmut Marko. This proved to be the final straw for Red Bull and Helmut Marko, who announced that for the next race in Malaysia that they would be dropping Kvyat and who announced that for the next race in Malaysia Pierre Gasly would be taking Kvyat. Who after this race announced that Pierre Gasly would be taking Kvyat's seat at Toro Rosso for the next race in Malaysia. Who announced that Pierre Gasly would be taking Kvyat's seat for the next race in Malaysia, leaving Kvyat without a seat in F1 at all. But it wasn't all bad for Kvyat. At least he was out of this toxic environment, and for the first time in a while, he'd be able to watch the Formula 1 race at his home. And for the first time in a while, he'd be able to watch the Formula 1 race from the... And for the first time in a while, he'd be able to watch a live F1 race from the comfort of his own home. And seeing as Max Verstappen was crashing all the time, he'd be able to use the race in Malaysia that he'd watched at home to prove to Red Bull that they'd made the wrong decision in demoting him for that fraud Dutchman. And seeing as Verstappen was crashing all the time, he'd be able to use Malaysia... And seeing as Verstappen was crashing all the time, he'd be able to use the Malaysian Grand Prix that he'd watched at home to prove to Red Bull that... And seeing as Verstappen was crashing all the time, he'd be able to use Malaysia watching from home as a way to prove to Red Bull that they were wrong to demote him for that Dutch fraud. And seeing as Verstappen was crashing all the time, he'd be able to... And seeing as Verstappen was crashing all the time, he would use Malaysian Grand Prix... And seeing as Verstappen was crashing all the time, he'd use the Malaysian... And seeing as Verstappen was crashing all the time, he would use the Malaysian Grand Prix to prove to Red Bull that they were wrong to provide... And seeing as Verstappen was crashing all the time... And seeing as Verstappen was crashing all the time, he'd be able to use the Malaysian Grand Prix watching it from home instead to prove to Red Bull why they made a mistake in demoting him for that Dutch fraud. Now Kvyat did have one last race that year at the US. Now Kvyat did have one last race for the. Now Kvyat did have one last race that year, replacing Carl. Now Kvyat did have one. Now Kvyat did have one last. Now Kvyat did have one last race that year in 2017, replacing Carlos Sainz when he moved to Renault. And to be fair, he did. And to be fair, he did a very good job, scoring a point. And to be fair, he did a very good job that weekend, getting. And to be fair, he did a very good job that weekend. And to be fair, he did a very good job that weekend. And to be fair, he did a very good job that weekend, scoring a top 10 finish and comfortably outperforming. And to be fair, he did a very good job that weekend, scoring a top 10 finish and comfortably outperforming his teammate Brendan Hartley. But this would be short-lived, as for the very next race in Mexico. But this would be short-lived, as before the very next race in Mexico, But this would be short-lived, as before the very next race in Mexico, Red Bull announced that Kvyat would be leaving Toro Rosso, not. But this was short-lived, as after the race, Red Bull announced that Kvyat would be leaving the family, and this time on a permanent basis, meaning that Kvyat had no full-time drive, and Kvyat. But this was short-lived, as after the race, Red Bull announced that they would be. But this was short-lived, as after the race, Red Bull announced that Kvyat would be leaving the. But this was short-lived, as after the race, Red Bull announced that Kvyat would be leaving the family on a permanent basis this time, meaning he had no drive as of yet for 2018. But still, there were some positives. He at least had left the toxic Red Bull. But still, there were some positives. He had at least left the toxic. He had at least now permanently left the toxic drive. He had at least now permanently left the toxic environment that was the Red Bull Driver Academy, which probably felt like a weight off his shoulders, and was once again able to watch the Mexican Grand Prix from his home, and was once again able to watch the Mexican Grand Prix live from the comfort of his own home, and probably watch Verstappen just crash again. And probably watch Verstappen crash again, proving to Red Bull once again that they were wrong to demote him in favour of that Dutch fraud. Oh, for God's sake. Oh, for God's sake. Back to Alex Albon. Back to Alex Albon. After he finished second in the GP3 Championship in 2016, he graduated to the Formula 2 series. He graduated along with Charles Leclerc and others to the Formula 2 series in 2017. He graduated with Charles Leclerc along with others to the Formula 2 series for 2017.